Good afternoon. We might start to kick things off. Apologies that we are running a slight bit behind schedule. Who, out of interest, got to Kate McAllister's talk earlier on eating an Agile sandwich? Got a few hands going up here. I'll be talking about some really similar concepts, and so hers is actually a really quite complimentary talk. If you want to grab those slides and the recording later on when it's uploaded to Drupalgov, sort of some similar concepts. But I'll be digging in today into a few different bits and pieces. So hopefully you find this fairly valuable. So who am I? So my name's Adam Leayr. I'm the technical product manager for GovCMS with the Department of Finance. I've spent nearly a year working with the Agile and Scrum framework and alongside our product management team in there as well. Particularly what I'm looking at doing as well here with this is trying to contrast my experience with moving from more of the traditional waterfall development background. I'm a developer by trade and training. And just looking at and comparing that with my experience in moving across in more of the leading some of the Agile side of things that we do within the department. Recently certified Scrum Master through the Scrum Alliance, so in terms of credentials, at least someone's given me a bit of a tick there. And also my email address on the bottom. If you do have any questions about anything that I speak about today, even as well as about Agile more broadly in government, feel free to get in contact. I'm more than happy to talk to people in relation to that. So a bit of a summary, already spoken a bit, but we're going to cover off an overview of Agile and specifically the Scrum framework. We're going to look at the differences between Scrum and Waterfall. I'm going to share some of my experiences around transitioning between those as someone who is still reasonably new to Agile, despite many years of being with Waterfall. And I suppose that's where the title of the talk really comes from as well. It really has impacted the way that I look at delivering services now and really sort of focused around that customer centricity and that type of thing. We're going to dispel some Agile myths and then we're going to wrap it all up. So let's get into it. Let's get some definitions rolling. What is Agile? So I suppose Agile is a term that, if you hear when Kate was talking, it comes from the Agile Manifesto, which emerged from a 2001 gathering of a group of industry pioneers who had been developing new ideas and approaches independently to traditional document-driven and heavy software development processes. The Agile Manifesto, in terms of, a methodology or an ideology, is fairly succinct. But it gets to the heart of many issues that hold back traditional software teams and their associated stakeholders. And that often stops them from reaching their full potential. The core aspect of these, it's derived into 4 values, which are individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Fundamentally though, and I'll touch on this later on as well, the final paragraph that we have up there really makes clear that there are many critics of Agile, and they tend to just miss this slightly, that while we should value the items on the right, we value the items, and that's we value the items on that side, but we value the items on this side even more. So I'm going to just touch on the core values briefly and what they mean. So valuing individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Really this comes down to when we allow people to contribute their unique perspectives to your project. The result can often show why the whole is often regarded as greater than the sum of its parts. This isn't about ditching existing processes and tools and going back into the Stone Age though. In my experience, a lot of the time we force people to adapt rather to an archaic system, tools and processes that we already have in place to get the job done. New ways of working require new ways of thinking. It's not as if we're getting the best out of our talented people if we're just forcing them into a system that's never been examined, never been looked at, and never been challenged. And it's time, in that case, to look at making those tools fit your process in a more, I suppose, strategic way that maps around your people. The emphasis on teams and individuals puts the focus on them and their ideas, the innovation that they can bring, and their ability to solve problems. And if we move over to working software over comprehensive documentation, I'll be touching on this a little bit later as one of the myths that I speak about in terms of Agile. But all projects, I think we'd agree, do require some level of documentation. On Agile projects, however, documents are only useful if they serve the process of design and delivery of a project or a product in the most direct way. Agile projects concentrate on the documents necessary to support this product development, and this approach simplifies the administrative paperwork or even burden of relating to time, budgeting, scope definition, and the ongoing reporting side of things as well. And I will draw back the attention, because this is one of the things that tends to be a bit of a bugbear. People think that Agile is anti-documentation, and we'll talk about that later. But I really do want to stress that we're not trying to say don't do documentation. We're trying to value, look at what's more important. And especially when we look at things like auditing and that type of thing, obviously documentation is a required aspect of that. But we value working software more as an end product. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. The Agile pioneers understood that confrontation doesn't make for constructive conversations. I think we can all agree with that. So rather, they baked the understanding of the customer right into the methodologies and made the customer and our end users part of that project on an ongoing basis. So historically, project management has involved customers at 3 stages. Project inception, so obviously when the customer and the project manager or the team negotiate requirements or the contract or how we're going to go about this. Anytime that there's a scope change, when the customer and the project manager sit down and they negotiate that the market has changed and we need to respond and adapt to that. And at the project conclusion, when the project team delivers that final product to the customer. And if that product doesn't happen to meet the expectations, we will often see the project manager and the customer investigate changes, just to put it mildly. I suppose this historical focus on this negotiation process that's happened sort of in a traditional waterfall environment has discouraged valuable customer input. And it often has been this place where it's created sort of a terse or even an adversarial relationship between customers and project teams. And with Agile approaches, you're really trying to bake this in with approaching the product as a partnership between the customer and the development team, in which discovery, change during the project duration become routine, acceptable, and able to be responded to. And that flows into, I suppose, the final point of responding to change over following a plan. Many of the Agile management principles allow and in fact encourage project teams to respond quickly to customers, users and the market more broadly to develop relevant products that people actually want to use. So traditionally we would attempt to wrestle the change monster and pin it to the ground. Change management procedures and budget structures that actually can't operate in this environment make it a lot more difficult, and certainly in government we sort of work within that framework that can make it difficult to adopt some of these practices. Thus, project teams often find themselves blindly following a plan, missing opportunities to create more valuable products And as your product develops through the elapsing of time and the knowledge that's created through that, we often see the ability to make change decrease and the costs escalate in making those changes. By contrast, Agile projects tend to take a more systematic approach to accommodating change, and this allows us really throughout planning and prioritisation on a regular basis, allows these project teams to respond more quickly, and this flexibility actually increases, in a lot of cases, project stability if you have a mature team behind the process, because change becomes predictable and it becomes manageable. So, as previously unforeseen events, for instance, unfold, we can more easily accommodate these. New items become opportunities to provide additional value instead of being obstacles to avoid, giving projects teams greater opportunities for success. Kate actually had a slide with some of the 12 Agile principles on it. I just wanted to call out the Agile Manifesto website. There's a whole list of them there, and really they delve deeper into some of these concepts that I've talked about already. So specifically, what is the Scrum framework that we use as part of GovCMS? And I suppose, how does that relate? So Mike Combe, the author of Introduction to Scrum Methodology, has a good, simple definition for Scrum. An agile framework that allows us to focus on delivering the highest business value in the shortest time. Scrumguides.org expands on this to explain the Scrum framework consists of Scrum teams and their associated roles, events, artifacts, and rules. Each component within the framework serves a specific purpose and is essential to Scrum success and usage. The rules of Scrum bind together the events, roles, artifacts, governing the relationship and interaction between them. It should be noted that Scrum is more of a delivery framework, and this is an important distinction for a couple of reasons. Firstly, by focusing on how to deliver products effectively, it allows Scrum to be wrapped by other methodologies and processes where it makes sense. It's not prescriptive in that regard. Some critics argue that Scrum doesn't place enough focus on architectural components or discovery at the start of a project, but there's actually nothing stopping you from doing a longer discovery period before getting into a project and trying to deliver it. Secondly, as a framework itself, it really is about how you build on top of Scrum and on Agile more broadly to make it work for you. In a lot of cases, particularly with frameworks such as service delivery ones like ITIL, many of us might be aware of those, we often get people that go, we're not true ITIL, or we're not true this, or we're not true that. And as Kate touched on earlier, there's not really a true Agile. As a framework, we're really just trying to deliver loose couplings of ideas and methodology that make sense to improve the way that we deliver products. And in doing that, part of that is about delivering the framework for your organisation in a way that makes sense to how you operate. So I wanted to just touch briefly a little bit on Agile versus Waterfall as sort of concepts, and I think many of us, is there a bit of show of hands, who's sort of operated under a sort of that waterfall sort of structure where you start with your discovery phase and then you just move through all these iterations of design and development through to the final sort of testing component? There's quite a few hands going up. So, I mean, this chart really probably, so the red line is the waterfall process and the blue line is Agile. And this really does oversimplify it to an extent, but I do like it from the perspective that often what we find is that as we deliver the spec for a waterfall project, our risk does drop slightly. And that's what you can see at the top there. But often the way that we deliver waterfall-based projects is that risk is then carried throughout the development process because we're not involving our customers in a formal feedback loop process. So we actually don't know necessarily in a lot of cases, it's certainly my experience with large-scale projects, we don't actually know how we're doing until we get closer to UAT, or the user acceptance testing stage, and then the customer traditionally says, it's not really quite what I thought was going to be delivered. Whereas we look at sort of Agile, and the idea really being that we want to start small, we want to deliver on a regular basis, and so we can start delivering points of, I suppose, validation, where we can start to tease those ideas with our stakeholders and say, is this what you envisaged? And we can refine and we can develop because of that change culture that's really built into Agile at its core. And that allows us to really sort of see risk mitigated as we ourselves as a delivery team start to understand the constraints and potentially even things that our stakeholders didn't realise at inception. And here's another chart as well. So this one's particularly looking at unlocking business value. And again, what we see is almost the inverse, really, where there's value in a scope, there's a value in defining what our requirements are in terms of project delivery, but we're often, and this is my experience, and I'm not saying that this is all waterfall projects, but what will often be the case is due to political or market reasons, we might end up with 4 months into a 6-month project, somebody says it's time to launch. And I don't know if people have the same experiences as I do, but often it's someone fairly influential, they need to respond, they need to do something, and what we end up with is final development gets dropped, the final testing component gets dropped, we end up releasing a product to the market or to government that essentially is unvalidated. It's not been tested, really, and we don't know whether or not it meets the objectives of what we set out to do because we haven't followed the entire process through to conclusion. Whereas with sort of an Agile methodology, hopefully if we're reasonably mature in that, we're actually testing and validating things as we go as part of that entire cycle. And so if we did get to month 4 and somebody said, hey, it's time to release, what we actually have is certainty in what we've already delivered. And as part of Agile, part of the methodology is delivering your highest business value items first. So what we should be seeing in that first spike is the highest business value items completed, finished. We move on to less important things as we move through the delivery process. And so by the time we get to month 4, the bits in that, I suppose, 10 to 20% at the top there that might have missed out, they're not the big things that we've been avoiding because they're difficult. They're actually things that they're nice to haves, but they're not required. We're going to see a lot of value from this in terms of getting released. So I just want to just touch on a gotcha at this stage, and it sort of flows quite nicely from specs being misunderstood at that conception stage. And if we look at, I think this is a really interesting thing that I actually found on Facebook recently. And if there's any developers in the room, we'll sort of get this. And there was a really eye-opening comment as I read the comments threads, and I know that's a dangerous thing to do on Facebook, but it's Joseph writes, and this is another fine example of an end user getting exactly what they asked for, but not what they wanted. And how many times, I suppose, have we sat in project requirements meetings and we think, yeah, we've understood, we've got this, we know what's going on, and we get to the delivery stage and we say, hey, this is what you're after, and they're like, oh, actually, that's got nothing to do with what we were after. If people know the age-old comic of the tyre swing, it's a similar concept. So, I mean, really, I think this demonstrates the different language that we often speak. What makes complete sense in one person's head, especially in a business sense, can be completely different in how someone else interprets it, especially our training, our culture, can often just really get in the way of that. And I suppose that's what I'm going to be talking on a little bit later as well. So I've worked under structures in IT departments previously where even developers, they haven't been empowered to talk directly with product owners or stakeholders for whatever reason. And so that discussion would be typically handled by a project office. They would go out and talk to the stakeholder and then relay that information back to the development team. And I think, as we can see from some of the charts and from that image as well, like, that can be quite a dangerous concept. Unfortunately, my experience is such that the project officers often don't have the underlying technical knowledge to adequately translate these requirements, and it results in a lot of wasted time from the development team asking questions and a bit of head scratching trying to decipher what was meant, or they develop something thinking that they've understood perfectly, only to find that that's not what was meant at all. So this often obviously results in poor outcomes when the product owner is kept away from the team trying to implement their solution. So I did want to, I'm not trying to bash waterfall as, as this terrible methodology that we've had, for decades, and that it's a disaster, and that, we really should be trying to run from it as fast as we can. There are strengths of this as a process. And I do want to touch on, just briefly on this, so that people don't sort of think that I've just been drinking the Agile Kool-Aid for the last 12 months and thinking that, this is the bee's knees. But waterfall really, it's for experienced teams with skin in the game, having performed the same task over and over again, where there's a low risk of variance to the norm, where stakeholders have high levels of confidence in their delivery team, and there's limited or no need for consultation. All of those aspects generate risk, and as we've seen, risk in a waterfall project can cause issues towards the back end when we're trying to deliver that to our customers. I will say that it can be very efficient. Automotive production lines, they're employees with set skill sets. They do their part, they move on to the next piece, and that type of efficiency can be very good for organisations depending on what you're trying to achieve. So I'm not trying to say Agile is everything. I'm not saying that waterfall doesn't have its place. So, Agile is the answer to everything. And those that are familiar with Bedridge's law of headlines, he basically says that any time a publication asks a question in a title, you can normally answer no and be correct. And that's essentially what we're going to say here. And we'll move on to sort of the second experience here, and that's having, inside an Agile process, what falls down and what causes this to break sometimes. And that's an absent product owner. So Agile and/or the Scrum framework itself is predisposed to delivering business value more quickly. However, it does mean that the product owner, or that direct key stakeholder, needs to be available in order to ensure a quality result is obtained at the end of each of those iterative processes as you go through that build. In an exercise with GovCMS, we were assisting an agency with moving their site to Drupal and onto the GovCMS software as a service platform. And it was early days for us in terms of developing the methodology on how to best achieve this. And instead of the product owner joining us for a couple of weeks while we built this out, or even attending the daily, process, it's called a daily scrum, where the development team gets together and they talk about their priorities and their processes and keeps the sprint or the iteration on track. And we didn't have the customer attending that either. They were based in Canberra and we communicated with them via email. And so even though the customer was responsive and they replied to emails only within a couple of hours on a regular basis, we often found that feedback loop was actually far too slow for us. And the development team ended up spending quite a lot of time waiting for feedback and switching between tasks rather than being able to completely follow tasks through from start to end due to that delay in the feedback loop. It's been described that Agile teams are needy. I don't disagree with this definition. I'm looking at you, Doug. No. And it's often said in a negative connotation. As a product owner myself for GovDex as well, I can't think of a more valuable way to spend my time than with the development team as they're building out my product, as I'm the interface between customers and their feedback and that continuous improvement process. Yes, we're busy, owners of products, owners of tasks and processes, we're busy. But your product and what you're delivering is important as well. And it's about delivering value to people who need it. And if we're not committed to delivering the best value that we can, and in an appropriate time frame for that, then I suppose we have to ask ourselves what the point of our product is. And probably another experience is, especially for teams that start to pick up Agile, and you have this process of iterative developments where we set out our processes each time, and what we're actually doing is that we're just effectively doing waterfall inside a sprint. And so this is one of the issues that development teams face, who they've been used to doing it in a waterfall way, and then they try Agile, and they often end up with, as their iterations as a 2-week cycle, you have a cross-functional team inside of that sprint process, and you have a tester in there, you have a developer, you have BAs, you have a designer. And they often operate in this condensed pattern where the designer does all of their work up front, then it gets handed to the developer, then it gets handed to the tester, and all it is a faster way of doing waterfall with a little bit of customer feedback. The problem with this approach, and it's the same issue as waterfall projects, is that it's twofold. And firstly, we have this issue of sequential processing, where devs can't actually do any work until the designer has finished their part. Testing can't start until the developer has finished theirs. Testing in particular will often get compromised at the end, as we know, because of time constraints. And we're back to the same problem. Poor testing, low levels of confidence in our code base, and future changes that we're trying to work out whether or not they adversely affect other bits and pieces. Secondly, often due to these sequential workloads, we end up with dead resources, developers with nothing to do because the design hasn't actually been finished. More mature Agile teams recognise this, and as you go through that learning experience, you'll sort of pick this up as you go. And it often becomes a rule that creates a block like this that isn't easily navigable. It shouldn't be included then in that current iteration. If you have a big dependency, that means the development team can't actually work on something until the designers are finished, you'd split that up into one iteration is the design work, one iteration later will be implementing what that work is. And as you become mature, you pick up on that and you learn to plan more appropriately. So I just want to move on to some of the myths about Agile that do circulate as well, and there's a couple here that I just want to touch on briefly. And often these can be born out of some misunderstanding and or even blind faith within the Agile community that do think that it's the bee's knees. And so I'd like to talk to a couple of those. And the first is that Agile is the silver bullet and or magic. I think really you're going to get out of this and any framework and any methodology what you put into it. It's not going to do it for you. Agile also tends to require a culture around what you're trying to achieve. Senior management buy-in is very important, and that might mean that you need to spend time evangelising and educating the concepts. Scrum as a framework, its ability to get things done is it's based around breaking down of requirements into smaller and smaller pieces, and we call those user stories and epics. So if you can't do that effectively, it's going to be difficult to implement Scrum. Cool. So on the management side, Scrum allows a product owner to set either delivery date or the product scope and not both. If you have trouble with that sort of concept internally, then it's going to be a more education-based exercise. And finally, if your team isn't cross-functional, if you can't bring together a team that's self-contained, that contains programmers, testers, BAs, DBAs, potentially designers, depending on the program requirements, obviously, then you might struggle as well, because that's one of the really core concepts. So one of the other myths is that Agile is anti-documentation, as I was talking about earlier. So going back to the manifesto, it's not that Agile is anti-documentation, it's just that working solutions are valued more so. But many of us do work in regulated environments, and we need to produce documentation, whether that be procurement documentation, IRAP documentation to comply with Department of Defence Information Security Manual, or we even get just audited in general on a regular basis. So obviously we need documentation, and that should be built into your processes. Ideally, if that's really important to you, you should consider a technical writer as part of that iteration, as part of your cross-functional team, in order that your documentation stays up to date. That said, there are often good reasons to question the documentation that we produce. I used to work for an organisation that used to produce a 60-page monthly management report. No one read it. It was a great expense to the organisation for the staff time to produce it, and it basically got filed. I suppose it's great to ask why, and I read recently that someone who recommends that you should ask why 5 times to get to the root cause of really why somebody thinks something is important. And often, if you stop producing it and just see who complains, that can often be an indicator as well as to documentation that's not really worthwhile. It's useless to people if we write it and then we put it away and never touch it again. So yeah, I really encourage people on the documentation front, don't go away thinking that Agile's anti-documentation, but do think that this is something that we really could look at in terms of improving our processes. And the final myth that I'll touch on before I finish it up is that Agile requires a lot of expensive reworking. And it's probably my favourite myth. And yes, Agile and Scrum will contain an amount of rework or refactoring, as it is often referred to. That's the reality of moving quickly and responding to change, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. In my experience, the early value that Scrum adds or unlocks for the business by delivering more regularly more than covers this cost of refactoring down the track. By focusing on items that are the biggest business value in our iterative cycles, we're ensuring that the problems that cause users efficiency issues or slowdown issues are resolved quickly, and the net cost or productivity benefit from allowing a large group of users to get back on with their job, as an example, is much more efficient and timely, in a much more efficient and timely manner, really pays for itself. So IBM produced a white paper in 2008 called Minimising Code Defects to Improve Software Quality and Lower Development Cost. And it's a really good quote that I've pulled out of there. It says, and because of the cost of fixing defects increases exponentially as software progresses through the development life cycle, it is critical to catch defects as early as possible. The costs of discovering defects after release are significant, up to 30 times more than if you catch them in the design and architectural phase. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that Agile is well suited to discovering these bugs faster, because we should be constantly validating and testing our assumptions and our output. And one of the big reasons waterfall bugs or issues are so expensive to fix is because of that sequential nature of the project. It's like a production line. Architecture does their part, design does their part, and development does theirs. We get to the end of the project, we realise that the infrastructure doesn't scale, and the architecture team probably have been disbanded by this stage or on other projects. So bringing them back together away from other projects costs real money. What if you had contractors on board and you can't get them back? You then have to have new people come in, understand the whole project before they can even start to resolve problems. So Agile's bite-sized approach to this issue gives teams the best chance of realising these issues early and fixing them sooner before we move on. So I suppose in summary, really for me, and why this has made such a difference to me, is that it comes down to focus, not just in the iterations themselves, but more holistically. We're teaching our delivery teams to care beyond a spec document. We're also able to understand business value and the drivers that we're all working towards. When we're all singing from the same song sheet, there's a greater focus on customer collaboration and communication. There's a greater focus internally as we're working towards these goals. Delivering business value sooner. At the end of each iteration, Scrum talks about having a potentially shippable increment. I prefer the phrase potentially validatable increment. If you have a project to build 50 data dashboards, for instance, at the end of an iteration, you have 3 of them done, you're probably not going to ship that. But you can definitely start validating the ideas and the user interface and the concepts with your stakeholders to refine and make changes early rather than later. The benefit of this, obviously, is if we get 75% into time and there's a directive to launch quickly, we'll have close to 40 dashboards done, tested, and we know the customer is happy with the result because we've been working through these over time. Finally, putting the end customer front and centre. We're putting the product owners as their representative in the same environment as our delivery team. We want our delivery team not to be separate from the realities of the scenarios that we're building for. Greater understanding of the end of these leads to better outcomes. And really, this scales beyond Drupal. We might be using this for site building as we do, but this often, in many cases, is beyond software. Scrum's moving into other areas of industry as well, and I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to try it out for yourselves and see if it works for your team. So, thank you. We won't do questions now because we are running out of time. Gavin's given me the eye, but do feel free to contact me. Slides will be up on SlideShare as well as the conference talks are being recorded. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon.